In the last lecture, we began looking at Darwin's naturalistic theory of evolution, the idea that an unguided process of natural mutation and natural selection has resulted in the existence, basically, of everything that exists. We saw that that theory made specific predictions concerning the fossil record, and the fossil record is absolutely contradictory to that theory. And we also looked at microbiological evidence, which likewise shows that the microbiological evidence directly contradicts what that theory would posit. In this lecture, I want to build on that and look at some other important aspects of the theory of evolution, because Darwin, he raised, as you may recall, the issue of what the fossil record should show, and said that the fact that it doesn't show that is basically a serious, if not fatal, objection to his theory. But he also raised the issue of what he called organs of extreme perfection and complication. In his book, The Origin of Species, he said, quote, "To suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection, seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down," end quote. As we're going to see, we now know from all of the microbiological and other evidence that any complex organ cannot possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, which means that, according to Darwin's own statement, his theory has absolutely broken down. Now, typically in textbooks, high school textbooks, what evidence do they generally speak of? Textbook cases whereby genetic mutations combined with natural selection are said to produce new organs, forms, functions, or organisms. Well, the most famous textbook case is the famous peppered moth, because when pollution during the Industrial Revolution darkened tree trunks, the lighter moths stood out, so birds were more could easily find them to eat them, and therefore the number of darker moths increased dramatically. However, when pollution was cleaned up, lighter moths became prominent again. And so this textbook case of the peppered moths shows nothing concerning actual evolution. It just shows that one type of being, the moth, they all remain peppered moths from beginning to end, but just the percentage of light ones or dark ones varied depending upon the circumstances. There is nothing in that example that shows the kind of complex design needed to go to evolve something from the amoeba stage all the way up to mankind. Now, there's been a number of other textbook cases of evolution. Probably the most worked on or mutated creature in existence is the fruit fly. And so thousands, if not millions, of mutations have been done to the fruit fly. But what we see is these mutations are generally go in an adverse way. They affect the development of certain organs, and they may bring about changes, but they lead to arrests in development and abnormalities, for example, crippled wings and so on and so forth. These gene mutations in the fruit fly have never produced any new organs, but they merely produce deviations from the norm, which are largely abnormalities. And as Arthur Kessler wrote, none of the mutations observed in millions of fruit flies have produced offspring showing any evolutionary advantage. Now, on the Galapagos Islands, where Darwin did some of his work, there are many variety of finches, which vary in their size and the size and shape of their beaks. These things have been likewise called a symbol of evolution. However, as with the peppered moths, the finches are still finches, and there's no evidence that they are evolving into anything else. So the predominance of larger versus smaller finches simply cycle back and forth depending upon dry or wet environmental conditions, very similar to the peppered moths. Now, to a large degree, Darwin based his theory on an analogy between natural selection and the artificial selection used by animal breeders or plant breeders who artificially try to select particular characteristics and to breed the animals or plants so that they will have particular characteristics. But we find in all of that, number one, when human beings are doing this, they have an end in mind. It's not just random, as Darwin's theory predicts. Furthermore, none of the animals or plants bred by human beings have changed from one kind to another. And, for example, with animals, tame animals that have reverted back to the wild state quickly lose the characteristics that were artificially bred into them. And so, once again, artificial selection does not result in the creation of any new species, but demonstrates the narrow limits within which species can vary. This is not evolution at all. So, in none of these examples, whether in the wild, peppered moths or finches, or domestically mutated and selected fruit flies or other animals, none of these things have resulted in the generation of any new organs, forms, functions, or organisms. And as Swedish embryologist Soren Lovestrup has stated, quote, "Nobody has ever demonstrated that natural selection can bring about anything but events that are trivial from an evolutionary perspective," end quote. And but now, particularly with the developments in the area of microbiology, the evidence conclusively demonstrates that evolution of new organs, forms, functions, and organisms is biologically impossible. Now, for example, with respect to the eye, look at what would have to happen. An allegedly light-sensitive nerve or cell must become a light-sensitive organ. It must then have a cup-like depression that has focusing capacity, which necessitates muscle changes. Then there must become a lens. Then focusing must become imaging. This has to occur twice, because animals have two eyes. There must be nerve connections to the brain, which reverses or interprets a reverse image. For example, in the image in the back of the brain is upside down compared to what we see. How could that have any selective advantage at all? And the visual cortex is at the back of the brain, whereas the eyeballs are in the front of the head. And the right side of the visual cortex is associated with the left-hand field of vision, and vice versa. Now, all of these changes would have required thousands upon thousands of favorable mutations, which all would have to take place simultaneously. And none of these could have any selective advantage until all were properly in place. The series, that whole scenario is absolutely ludicrous. And there's absolutely no evidence, experimentally or in nature or anywhere else, that that has ever occurred in any organism whatsoever. And also, of course, to create the eye, the bony orbits would have to be mutated to house the globe of the eye. The bone must have appropriate holes to allow the appropriate mutated blood vessels and nerves to feed the eye. Just all kinds of things. As you know, as one writer puts it, the spontaneous mutation of sufficient DNA to code just the lens of the eye would be roughly equivalent to the formation of a chapter in a book from an explosion of letters. Uh, you know, but that's what naturalistic evolution contends. Basically, undirected evolution is not even a possible means for the creation of the eye or other organs of extreme perfection or complication. Take another example. Consider the supposed evolution of sexual reproduction. Now, supposedly the first cellular forms of life would have reproduced asexually by some means of cellular division. However, at some point, sexual reproduction is said to have evolved. Even more than the eye, the evolution of sexual reproduction necessitates an enormous series of coordinated mutations, only this time in two separate individuals, not one. A partially developed sex organ could have no survival at all. Indeed, a partially evolved sex organ would not function and therefore would not cause survival at all, would be contraindicated. Furthermore, to evolve sexual reproduction, mutations must lead to the evolution of both male and female genitalia, with all the attendant components. For the male, penis, sperm, testicles, vas deferens, and for the female, egg, uterus, fallopian tubes, and vagina, all fully developed and coordinated. And the two individuals would have to have evolved these things at the same time and in the same place, and then found each other. Furthermore, asexual reproduction results in much more offspring than sexual reproduction. And so sexual reproduction, the whole point of evolution is to leave the most offspring. So the claim that sexual reproduction evolved, it goes against the whole theory of evolution itself, because you wouldn't want to evolve something that results in fewer offspring when you can get much more by asexually reproducing. So as Arthur Koestler summarizes, he says, the doctrine that the coming together of all requisite changes was due to a series of coincidences is an affront not only to common sense, but to the basic principles of scientific explanation. In other words, this is not science at all. Now, there's another aspect of this that is not so often considered. Most people, when they think of evolution, they think of the development of new forms of physical structures. But Koestler adds the significant fact that evolution also supposedly results not only in new shapes and structures, but new types of behavior, new instinctual skills, which are innate and hereditary, such as, for example, the butterfly and bird migration, and the development of human language, which is unlike anything else in the animal kingdom. So this behavioral, there's just absolutely no way even being proposed how that could even possibly have occurred. Now, in his 1996 book, Darwin's Black Box, The Biochemical Challenge to Evolution, biochemist Michael Behe discussed the issue of what he called irreducible complexity. He used the example of a common mousetrap because he said that all the parts of a mousetrap, the spring, hammer, catch, platform, and holding bar, must all be present must all be of the proper kind and shape, must all be in their proper places and in proper working order, or the mousetrap is worthless. It's the same at the biological level. He points out even the simple cell. People tend to think of cells as just very simple things. They are not at all. Cells are more than irreducibly complex systems. They evince, the common cells, evince clearly purposeful activity, which is a hallmark of design. He studied both the cilium and flagellum in the cells, and points out that since his book, in the 10 years following his book Darwin's Black Box, the knowledge of the cilium and flagellum had increased exponentially, and we now know that cilium and flagellum are part of a complex cellular construction machinery. That the cilium is a sophisticated chemical sensor involving a wide array of biological processes. He says, such coherent, complex cellular systems did not arise by random mutation and natural selection any more than the Hoover Dam was built by the random accumulation of twigs, leaves, and mud. In fact, in cells, in the generation of protein chains, which initiate and sustain growth, in the cells, there's called something a codon, which is a DNA or RNA sequence of 3 nucleotides that forms a unit of information. Now, these codons instruct the cell to start the creation of a protein chain, to add a specific amino acid to the growing chain, or to stop creation of the protein chain. Now, I.L. Cohen discusses the significance of this. He says the fact that this system includes a stop-go signal has significant implications. It indicates a predetermined purposefulness of action, a knowledge of an expected future necessary within an enormously complex yet perfect system. Purposefulness is clearly a reflection of sophistication or intelligence. These are not characteristics that we can attribute to unthinking chemical atoms and molecules. It reflects a level of intelligence far higher than anything we are familiar with, certainly far superior to our own level of intelligence and knowledge. Once again, the existence, what we know now about the nature of cells themselves and the parts of cells, it is physically impossible for that to have happened by accident through chemical processes. It all reflects design and purpose, and that, in other words, it is inconsistent and contradictory to the theory of naturalistic evolution, but it is consistent with Christianity and theism, God's having designed this. Now, you think about it also. Natural selection is said to arise from or act upon random mutations and variations. However, natural selection, by its very nature, is not designed to create new organs. Rather, natural selection acts on species and characteristics that already exist to eliminate the less fit in their so-called struggle for existence. It's to conserve the form and function of an organism rather than to transform it. And so two German scientists generated thousands of mutations in the fruit flies, and they earned a Nobel Prize for their work. They found that without exception, the mutants died as deformed larvae long before reaching the reproductive age. And so they found that after they got the Nobel Prize, they continued their work. They found in all cases in which mutations in the regulatory genes that affect body plan formation occur, early in the development of the organism, embryonic death of the organism inevitably occurred. In other words, that the animals did not even live to be able to change or reproduce. So that since mutating the genes that regulate body plan construction destroys the organism as it develops embryonically, mutations combined with natural selection could not possibly build body plans in the first place or develop new body plans. Furthermore, Michael Behe, who wrote Darwin's Black Box, and physicist David Snoke assessed the plausibility of naturalistic evolution generating two or more coordinated mutations. Because remember, to create an eye or any other complex organ, you need not only more than two, you need thousands of coordinated mutations. Well, their work found that mutation and selection could generate two coordinated mutations in 1 million generations. However, that only occurred in a population of 1 trillion or more multicellular organisms, a number that exceeds the size of the effective breeding population of practically all animal species that have ever lived at any given time. And two coordinated mutations could occur in a population of only 1 million organisms. But for that to occur, it would take 10 billion generations, which would equate to 10 billion years, or more than twice the age of the Earth, as it is estimated by most scientists. In other words, it could not possibly happen. Now, perhaps more fundamentally, DNA contains the genetic information that allows all organisms to live, develop, function, grow, and reproduce. DNA is like a computer code, and even Richard Dawkins, well-known atheist today, who writes, acknowledges that our genetic system is like a computer and is digital to the core. Genes are pure information. Now, but the fact of the matter is that Michael Denton asked the obvious question: is it really credible that random processes could have constructed a reality, the smallest element of which, the functional protein or gene, is complex beyond our own creative capacities, a reality which is the very antithesis of chance, which exceeds in every sense anything produced by the intelligence of men? I mean, it is beyond belief, this whole idea of naturalistic evolution. And in fact, Eric Davidson of California Institute of Technology studied the genetic regulatory basis of animal development. He's studied that probably more than any other researcher. And he says that all organisms' body plans are controlled not by single genes, but by a developmental gene regulatory network or networks. Now, to develop new organs, forms, functions, and organisms would require changing these developmental gene regulatory networks, and this could not occur without multiple coordinated mutations, which, as we saw with the cilium and flagellum, is impossible. In short, our understanding of genetics and microbiology, of which, remember, Darwin knew nothing of this, our understanding now renders naturalistic evolution biologically not improbable, but impossible. So the, even Behe studied the history of malaria and the malarial parasites, and has found that variation and natural selection, yes, it does cause some changes, but they are inevitably harmful. And the the changes occur only within strict limitations. Darwin summarizes the scientific data. He says, Darwin and design hold opposite firm expectations of what we should find when we examine a truly astronomical 100 billion number of organisms. In other words, the intensive studies of malaria discussed in his book. He says, up until recently, the magnitude of the problem precluded a definite test, but now the results are in. Darwinism's most basic prediction is falsified. Mutation, variation, and natural selection simply do not and cannot result in the development of new organs, forms, functions, and organisms. And so the Darwin himself cited the complexity of organs as a ground for falsifying his theory of naturalistic evolution. And so now the research data is in. He didn't know about any of the microbiology, but now the data is in. And so we need to ask the question, which view is more reasonable? Which view better fits the facts? That the eye and other such organs and the variety of different organisms evolved by undirected natural selection playing upon chance mutations, or that such organs and organisms were designed by God for a purpose. Everything that we now know says the latter. But that's not all. We have all of that data, but this raises the issue, which has been raised by multiple philosophers and scientists regarding, is naturalistic evolution even a science at all? Science is typically defined as a system of knowledge of the physical world through the scientific method, namely experimentation, observation, experimentation, the development and testing of hypotheses, and so on and so forth. Yet, I mentioned earlier in an earlier lecture, Karl Popper, who said the real issue is whether a theory is falsifiable or can be refuted on any basis, because a hypothesis that is not subject to the possibility of rejection by observation and experiment cannot be regarded as scientific. Now, Darwin was only looking for things to try and confirm his theory and explain away the lack of negative evidence. He was not looking for ways of falsifying his theory, although, as we have pointed out in his book, he does give us tests, both the fossil record. If his theory is true, it would show innumerable transitional forms. That does not exist. He also raised the issue of complex organs such as the eye, and if he said if it is demonstrated that they cannot be formed by chance selection and mutations, then his theory is absolutely falsified. We now have the data, and as I've just indicated, complex organs, forms, functions, and organisms cannot be generated by chance mutations and natural selection. But the fact is that the whole theory of evolution is basically a statement of what happened in the past, but it is not subject to experimentation, because, as I quoted from Behe and Snoke, it takes millions of generations to get even two coordinated mutations. That's far beyond the time. You can't observe this happening. In fact, even Stephen Jay Gould, again, the late well-known Harvard biologist, said that Darwin's theory is not even a scientific theory at all, but it's basically a big idea, a comprehensive worldview, a historical hypothesis that cannot be seen or derived by experiment, and it cannot proceed by direct experiment or repetition. It's based on analogy, not observation, which means that it is not a science. By definition, it's not science. In fact, Karl Popper, as I say, 20th century's probably leading philosopher of history, concludes that Darwinism, both in its original form and in its modern forms, quote, is not a testable scientific theory, but a metaphysical research program, end quote. Pierre-Paul Grasset and Sir Fred Hoyle call it a pseudoscience. So it's a metaphysical theory, not a scientific one. But the situation is even more damning than that, because Yale biology professor Keith Thompson points out that the traditional paleontological proof of finding ancestors in the fossil record cannot be tested by assembling a nice series of fossils without discontinuities. But you could assemble anything, and one person could say that A led to B, led to C, led to D. One could say that no, D led to A, led to C, led to B. And in other words, as one writer pointed out, fossils may tell us many things, but one thing they can never disclose is whether they were the ancestors of anything else. And consequently, the theory of naturalistic evolution is merely a tautology. What's a tautology? A tautology is a circular argument, something defined in terms of itself. In other words, naturalistic evolution talks about the survival of the fittest. Well, who survives? The fittest. Who are the fittest? Those who survive. Or some evolutionists say the fittest individuals in a population leave the most offspring. Okay, who are the fittest? Answer, those who leave the most offspring. Who leave the most offspring? Answer, those who are the fittest. It's a tautology, a circular argument that cannot be contradicted, because anything, they'll say is possible. In other words, tautological statements cannot be falsified and therefore are not scientific. Therefore, since evolution is a tautology, or a circularity, this is fatal to natural selection as a theory of how biological change occurs. Since that is so, and since I've discussed the science, it cannot result in the development of new organs, forms, functions, and organisms. Even evolutionists say that everything seems to have purpose and design all over them. Richard Dawkins says, all organisms appear to be designed. They seem to have purpose written all over them. But since naturalistic evolution cannot account for these organisms, they don't merely appear to have design, but they clearly have been designed, and the only one who can account for that is God. You see, the conclusion that creation has occurred by an intelligent designer flows naturally from the data itself. And the work done in biochemistry over the last few decades has confirmed that, because it reveals, as I.L. Cohen and Behe have pointed out, that even at the cellular level, it is all marked by purpose. So let me conclude this by quoting biologist Francisco Ayala. Now, he adheres to naturalistic evolution, but he concludes, quote, "The apparent strength of the argument from design to demonstrate the existence of a creator is obvious. Wherever there is a function or design, we look for its author. A knife is made to cut, and a clock is made to tell time. Their functional designs are contrived by a knife maker and a watchmaker. The structures, organs, and behaviors of living beings are directly organized to serve certain functions. Thus, the fundamental design, or teleology, of organisms and their features would seem to argue for the existence of a designer, and that designer can only be God. That conclusion is not just based upon what the Bible says, but the conclusion is what we see from the science and the nature of reality itself.